The Rise of the Global South. Colonial Reckonings and Cultural Revivals written by Rathi Agnihotri as former colonies reclaim their histories, challenge Western hegemony, and assert their cultural identities. The Global South is emerging as a transformative force, redefining the world order through civilizational revival, decolonized narratives, and collective geopolitical assertion. For a long time, the Western media coverage of developing and underdeveloped countries was informed by what can be aptly called the Third World gaze. Exaggerated images of poverty, hunger, destitution, malnutrition, mortality, superstition, etc. dominated the Western media's frames of reference. The West largely viewed these countries as an extension of their colonial past, turning their issues and affairs into ready-made caricatures, as it perpetually exoticized them in the light of time-worn colonial clichés and constructs. The term Third World originated during the Cold War. Initially, it did not have any inbuilt pejorative connotations and was used to define countries that didn't align themselves with NATO or the Warsaw Pact. The term was originally coined by French historian and demographer Alfred Sauvy in 1952 to refer to developing countries, many of which were still under colonial rule. Sociologist Peter Worsley further expanded its ambit to signify countries that were a part of the non-aligned movement. However, the term Third World slowly fell into disrepute as it began to be generously used by the Western media to stereotype and caricaturize developing countries as poor, dirty, squalor-ridden, and unstable banana republics. American activist and writer Carl Oglesby is believed to have coined the term Global South in 1969. He used it to describe countries with a shared history of colonialism and imperialism. In an article for the Catholic journal Commonweal, written during the height of the Vietnam War, Oglesby noted that the North's dominance over the Global South had created an unjust and unbearable world order. However, it was only with the end of the Cold War and the disintegration of the Soviet Union that the word Global South began to gain widespread prominence and was viewed as a more balanced and neutral term for referring to developing and underdeveloped countries, rather than the deeply condescending and patronizing term Third World. The Global South is playing an increasingly important role in today's rapidly changing world. The past decade can rightly be called the decade of its rise. It is leading the call for greater accountability from global institutions, such as the UN, which still reflect a colonial-era power structure dominated by the global North. With countries like India helping to unite and strengthen the Global South, this rise is not just about geopolitics. What truly defines it is a deeper civilizational and cultural revival, along with a strong push to build a more just and equal world, free from the influence of colonial narratives. Bound together by colonial history, the Global South is not a traditional or clearly defined bloc. It's not based on geography, and there is no firm agreement on which countries it includes. Generally, the term refers to nations in Asia, Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, and the Middle East. What unites these diverse regions is a shared history of colonialism and imperialism. These countries were subjected to a global order shaped by Western dominance, an order built on the deeply exploitative and dehumanizing legacy of colonial empires. They share a common history of cultural demonization, distortion, appropriation, large-scale resource plunder, and the brutal exploitation of their people. This is why understanding the Global South through the lens of colonial history offers more insight than viewing it purely in economic terms. China is a significant yet paradoxical player in the Global South. Though never formally colonized, it endured a form of economic imperialism that left deep and lasting scars. This legacy of humiliation and resistance continues to shape China's worldview and its assertive role on the global stage. Its open defiance of Western dominance and refusal to conform to Western norms have positioned it as a key player within the Global South. In the 19th century, British imperial policy flooded China with opium, leading to widespread social devastation and national unrest. China's resistance to this exploitation resulted in the Opium Wars, the outcomes of which were deeply humiliating: the cession of Hong Kong, the forced opening of treaty ports, and the granting of special privileges to foreigners. These events marked a profound loss of sovereignty and remain embedded in China's collective memory. This historical trauma continues to inform China's pursuit of global power. While it shares the Global South's opposition to Western hegemony, its methods often diverge from the values the grouping aims to uphold. While China's rejection of multilateralism, its debt diplomacy, and its poor human rights record conflict with the Global South's ideal of a just world, it's clear that China's rise is built on resisting Western dominance in global affairs. India is another key stakeholder in the Global South, a nation that, even after gaining independence, has continued to define much of its identity through the lens of its colonial past. The post-independence Nehruvian legacy fashioned India's internal image and external positioning in light of the so-called legacy of the British Empire and Islamic invaders. It encouraged a culture of abject subservience to Western values and ideals while systematically annihilating Bharat's civilizational and cultural roots. It is only in the past decade that a civilizational and cultural resurgence, rooted in India's ancient Hindu heritage, has begun to reshape the nation's identity, reversing centuries of colonial influence. Countries in Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean also bear numerous scars of colonization, with many of these nations still struggling with covert Western imperialism in the form of neocolonialism and neo-economic imperialism. Another significant development over the past 10 to 15 years has been the consolidation of the Global South as a collective force challenging colonial narratives. While most former colonies achieved political independence in the 20th century, the remnants of colonial influence persist. Today, under the banner of the Global South, many of these nations are actively reclaiming their indigenous histories and cultures more assertively and comprehensively. The following section explores this in greater detail. Global South's cultural reset and India's role. A process of civilizational and cultural resurgence is currently underway in the Global South, a phenomenon that has made rapid strides in the past decade. A quiet yet decisive cultural and civilizational shift is unfolding in the Caribbean as an increasing number of countries move to sever ties with the British monarchy. The momentum to break free from the symbolic authority of the British Crown grew significantly after the passing of Queen Elizabeth II in September 2022. In November 2021, Barbados became a republic by officially dissociating itself from the nominal power of the British Crown. Dame Sandra Mason was sworn in as the President of Barbados. In December 2024, the Jamaican government introduced a bill in its parliament to abolish the institution of the constitutional monarchy and facilitate Jamaica's transition to a republic. Antigua and Barbuda is expected to hold a referendum in the near future on whether to become a republic and remove the British monarch as head of state. In January 2025, Belize took a significant step toward decolonization by replacing Queen Elizabeth II's image on its banknotes with portraits of national icons, particularly those who played a pivotal role in shaping the country's independence movement. In Jamaica, a growing movement is advocating for the recognition of indigenous patois as an official language over English. Saint Lucia and Dominica have also advanced their decolonization efforts by incorporating indigenous languages into their school curricula. It is apt to briefly highlight India's role in advancing the decolonization of the Global South's civilizational and cultural narrative. India is not just a member, but a major force consolidating the bloc and shaping its collective identity. As India actively redefines its own civilizational narrative through its ancient Hindu heritage and values, its model of cultural decolonization may serve as a template for other Global South nations facing similar challenges, such as the glorification of colonial legacies, the dominance of the English language, and the neglect of indigenous cultures, traditions, knowledge systems, and languages. India's engagement with the Global South is also shaped by a civilizational perspective. It aims to unite the group through a shared narrative of decolonization and cultural revival. Prime Minister Modi's recent five-nation tour to Ghana, Argentina, Brazil, Trinidad and Tobago, and Namibia is a good example of this. The shared struggles against colonialism and the shared commitment to democracy and inclusive development were the major highlights of the speeches made in all these countries. He also spoke of the shared civilizational and spiritual legacy of India and the Global South. In Trinidad and Tobago, He further highlighted the shared civilizational bond of the Dharmidia culture and spoke of how India is actively working to create a database on the Dharmidia community. The community that forms the majority of the Indian diaspora in Trinidad and Tobago largely arrived as indentured laborers during the period of European colonization. Most importantly, India is working to unite the global south around common issues by blending a civilizational perspective with geopolitical goals to help build a more just and equal world order. This vision is based on rejecting extremism and terrorism, respecting sovereignty and territorial integrity, opposing expansionism, promoting democratic values, encouraging inclusive development, and shaping both domestic and global narratives through civilizational and cultural roots. Colonial reckoning. The Global South demands reparations. The consolidation of the Global South over the past decade has brought many long-suppressed issues to the surface. These countries are not only actively decolonizing their societies, but also demanding accountability from former colonial powers for the vast loot and exploitation they endured. One of the most contentious demands gaining ground is that of colonial reparations. Several countries in the Caribbean and Africa are now openly calling on former imperial powers, such as France and the UK, to pay reparations. Put simply, it means that former colonies are seeking monetary compensation for the tortures inflicted on their citizens and the damages inflicted on their economy. The Caribbean countries and the African Union also aim to create a united front to pressure European countries to compensate financially for the atrocities and horrors of slavery and colonialism. A first-of-its-kind reparations conference was organized in Ghana in November 2023. One of the significant achievements of the conference was that participating nations agreed to establish a global reparations fund to provide compensation to Africans for the atrocities of the slave trade. With the colonial reparations movement gaining strong momentum in recent years, the UK, one of the principal former colonial powers, now faces mounting pressure. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer and King Charles III are facing demands for a staggering $261 billion in reparations, particularly for the country's role in the transatlantic slave trade. Leaders from across the global south, including Barbados's Prime Minister Mia Mottley, have been outspoken in calling for financial compensation from former colonizers for their barbaric misadventures. Mottley has consistently argued that reparations must be a key part of the global reset and has stressed the need to confront the legacy of slavery and colonialism in modern global relations, as she noted in her address to the United Nations. The call for colonial reparations grew even louder at the two-day Commonwealth Summit held in Samoa in November 2024. The summit proved somewhat embarrassing for the UK, as several participating nations raised the issue of reparations in blunt and unequivocal terms, directly in the presence of British Prime Minister Keir Starmer and King Charles III. A red-faced UK, however, flatly refused to consider the demands for financial compensation for slavery and colonialism. In a desperate attempt to pull the wool over the participating nations' eyes, the former colonial power lectured on the supposed importance of letting go of the past and instead focusing on the present, characterized by issues like climate change, in tackling which the UK could perhaps offer assistance. While India has never officially demanded colonial reparations from the UK, it has been a vocal critic of colonialism, and its leaders haven't shied away from voicing these opinions publicly. Overall, India has played a pivotal role in challenging Western hegemony and fostering consensus in the global South on shared concerns and issues. Civilizational heritage as a decolonization tool, a shared cultural foundation, also unites the global South. Striking parallels and uncanny similarities can be observed between Hinduism and the ancient spiritual traditions of regions, such as Africa and Latin America before the arrival of Christianity. These countries also share a rich intellectual legacy, where literature served as a powerful tool of resistance against imperialism and colonialism. Additionally, there is significant overlap in their cultural values, ethical frameworks, belief systems, artistic practices, and indigenous knowledge traditions. For instance, African tribal cultures feature numerous gods, each associated with a specific function, such as the god of wind or the god of rain. This intricate system of multiple deities, each governing a particular aspect of life or nature, bears a striking resemblance to the Hindu tradition of devtas. However, the onslaught of Christianity in Africa wiped out many native traditions and superimposed an overarching Abrahamic narrative on the people. Similarly, Southeast Asia, a key region within the Global South, is united by its shared civilizational and cultural legacy as embodied in the Ramayana. Despite the region's rich diversity in local customs and traditions, countries such as Thailand, Malaysia, and Cambodia remain deeply connected through their shared spiritual heritage. Oral traditions form another strong cultural thread that binds the Global South. The legacy of oral narratives and storytelling has enriched the Latin American society and civilization since ancient times. Despite the onslaught of colonization, many indigenous belief systems and cultural forms were saved from destruction because of the prevalence of oral culture. India, too, has a vibrant heritage of oral culture where artistic forms are fluid and interconnected. Its folk traditions often blend music, dance, poetry, mime, and more into unified, dynamic performances that transcend rigid artistic boundaries. The Global South can effectively harness its shared cultural and civilizational foundations not only to strengthen mutual social, political, and economic ties, but also to challenge dominant Western narratives. By creating platforms to preserve and promote indigenous knowledge systems, cultural practices, and traditions, these nations can reclaim their histories and identities. Another area where the Global South could play a decisive role as a collective entity is in the context of decolonization of educational curricula and practices. The Global South struggle for a just global order, the Global South solidarity, is also marked by a quest to create a more just and egalitarian world order than the current one, which is largely rooted in Western hegemony. It addresses several key issues through multilateral forums and institutions such as BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the UN, issues that have the potential to play a decisive role in reshaping the global order. Whether it is climate justice, green energy, cooperation against terrorism, fair trade practices, or technology transfer, these issues are profoundly relevant to the Global South in addressing the historical injustices inflicted upon formerly colonized nations by their former colonial powers. Moreover, these issues are crucial for shaping a new global order rooted in genuine multilateralism and a rules-based system, one where all nations have equal opportunities and a level playing field. The voice of the Global South Summit can play a decisive role in forging Global South solidarity on pertinent issues, such as reforming multilateral institutions like the UN. An initiative of India, the summit was first launched in January 2023, with its second and third sessions held in November 2023 and August 2024, respectively. Although currently limited to a virtual format, the summit, if held online, can play a decisive role in outlining a blueprint for a world order based on the ideals of democracy and inclusive values. Wrapping up finally, it's essential to note that the civilizational and geopolitical narratives in the context of the Global South aren't mutually exclusive. On the contrary, these are deeply interconnected. By leveraging its shared civilizational and cultural roots and challenging colonial narratives, the Global South can indeed turn the geopolitical tables in its favor.